Thank you for joining the Once Changing the World, which is India's first future tech meets sustainability podcast. And today I'm delighted and honored to have with me Mr. Inderpal Bhandari, who's the Global Chief Data Officer at IBM. He has leveraged his extensive experience to lead the company's data strategy to ensure that IBM remains the number one AI and hybrid cloud provider for the enterprise. Under his leadership, the Cognitive Enterprise Blueprint, a roadmap for IBM's clients on their transformation journeys, was created. Mr. Bhandari is an expert in transforming data into business value and improved customer experiences by delivering strategic, innovative capabilities that use analytics insights to enable growth and productivity. He was named US Chief Data Officer of the Year by the CDO Club and named Corinium's top 100 innovators in data and analytics. He was also appointed as one of the global top 100 data visionaries by True Data. So, Mr. Bhandari, really appreciate you taking time being part of our humble podcast. Why don't we start with a little background, your journey in the world of frontier technology, role as the CDO, and why is it so critical?
So, from a journey standpoint, I was born and brought up in Kolkata, used to be called Calcutta, in India. And I went to BITS Pilani to study electrical and electronics engineering. And in those days, for higher studies, one used to look abroad. I mean, now, of course, in India, there are many opportunities within India itself. But in those days, to really pursue higher studies, you had to go abroad. So I ended up coming to the US, where I did my master's and PhD, both in computer engineering, electrical and computer engineering. And the PhD was from Carnegie Mellon. And my thesis was actually an AI thesis, an engineering AI thesis, which was probably one of the earliest engineering AI theses in artificial intelligence. And one of my advisors was actually Herbert Simon, who had the Turing Award, was a founder of AI. And so that's when the journey, I would say, actually started down this path of data and AI. From there, I went to the IBM Thomas J. Watson Research Center. That was my first go around with IBM. It was also my first job. I spent 7 years there. And one of the things I did was I created this computer program. Those days we used to call it data mining programs, which ended up being used by every team in the National Basketball Association. This was in the 1990s. And they used it to identify hidden patterns, counterintuitive patterns of play that they could exploit and leverage in their lineups for the playoff games. And that made me understand and appreciate just how wide-ranging the impact of such technologies could be. And I went off then to start my own company, data mining company, which I ran for about 10 years and probably did everything you could possibly think of doing wrong while doing that from a modern startup standpoint. So many lessons were learned, but it was my MBA on the street. And after that, I had a very good understanding of data for the enterprise and the fact that it could actually be very, very strategic for the enterprise, because I had been selling into enterprises as a vendor when I was running my own company. And I was consulting for a very large healthcare company, and they asked me, would I want to come and work for them? And I thought I would create this role of chief data officer in healthcare. I was really the first in healthcare. And just so that the companies could figure out a way to strategically leverage their data. So when I created that role in 2006, there were only 4 of us globally. I was the only one in healthcare, and there were 3 more. Then the profession actually took off. What happened was the CEOs became more aware of the value of data and the fact that, this is not just a byproduct of what we're doing, like exhaust in the business. This is actually something very strategic, that if we studied it and leveraged it, we would have insights that would give us some competitive advantages, etc. And so the profession took off. Now there are literally thousands and thousands of us, and they're all the derivative roles of analytics officer, transformation officer. They're all really about the same thing. It's all about digital transformation. So being one of the earliest in that game, in fact, by now of the original four, I'm the only one still doing that job. So I mean, it has allowed me to make this a craft because I've done it four times now, four different companies. IBM being the latest one, where I've been the global chief data officer for about the last 6 years, going on the seventh year now. So that's the story of the journey. In terms of why it's important, I alluded to it. It's, if you the data has always been around as long as computers were around. So if you go back to the 40s, 50s, there were people working the data aspect of computing, but usually they were in one of the back rooms in the CIO's office, and just making sure everything was running smoothly. It's only when there was this awareness that there is truly some strategic advantage to be had by looking at data, that the position became elevated to a C-suite role. And that's why the importance of it now you pretty much, I mean, I think any CEO you talk to in a large company will say, yeah, we need somebody to look at data strategically, to make it an asset for us, and then that's the role of the chief data officer.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your journey and the value of data over the years. Obviously, things have completely transformed. AI, which was, I mean, the things which were taking possibly maybe like a decade, it's now happening in possibly a year's time or even shorter space, because we creating so much of data. Everything that we do around the world, there's so much of data creation. The compute capabilities is leveraging us to infer the data and build value out of the data. Now, still, if you see, the real world implementations of AI is still slow. So which specific industry or sector do you see currently having the largest benefits?
Yeah, no, so it's a multi-layered question. It's important to understand several aspects of that. When you say slow, why is it slow? So we'll unravel all that in my answer. Let me first just respond to where we see value and our clients see a lot of value in terms of applying AI. So there are areas like customer care, employee experience, business operations, IT operations. These are some of the major areas where if you apply AI, you see the maximum benefit. And it's across industry. It cuts across industries. So to go back to your question, right, about the slowness. So I think the way I would describe it is, from a consumer standpoint, AI has actually been very well entrenched by now, and people understand the value thanks to the likes of Amazon and Google and other companies like that. People have understood that, yes, I will get some good suggestions potentially from these things that I'm doing based on the experience that I've had so far, and others like me have had so far. But from an enterprise standpoint of view, we didn't really understand what AI meant. And in fact, when I joined IBM as chief data officer, that was my data strategy. It was to make IBM itself into an AI enterprise so that our clients and customers could then look at what we've done, because they look a lot like us. They also have large companies, global footprint, lots of legacy. And then they know what to do, right? So it would give them a model. And of course, over this journey over the last 6 years, we've now figured out what it means for an enterprise to be an AI enterprise. It means you have to infuse it into every major business process. Your supply chain, your financial processes like accounts receivable, your research and marketing processes, essentially procurement, all the big operations that the business does. You want to infuse. Infuse means at every level, you want people making use of AI. And so that we kind of understand that's what needs to happen. And that's how an enterprise then sees tremendous value. We see drops of up to 90% in our end-to-end cycle time across these major processes. So then you can see the tremendous value of doing this. But it wasn't clear when we started. Now, if you then, with that knowledge, if you just sit back and think, if you're infusing AI into every major business process, that means that engine is actually learning about those business processes, which means it's learning about your intellectual property. So from a business standpoint, there are several other implications that go beyond the algorithms that must be considered. So we've got things like, can I trust this system? Can I trust the vendor that's providing it? Because it's going to soak up so much of my intellectual property. Then, because it needs to be infused into business processes are basically run by people. People have to make decisions. And going back to my early example of that MBA program that I had over 2 decades ago, the first time it actually found a counterintuitive pattern, the coach called me and said, how can I do this? So the pattern was something really unusual. It said, they were facing elimination, and it said, play two of your backup players in your starting lineup. This is equivalent to saying something like, play your tail ender as your opening batsman. Very counterintuitive. And they didn't know what to do. He said, if I follow this and we lose the game, I will lose the game, lose the series, lose my career, because everyone will think that that was an extremely foolish thing to do. And, I will be the laughing stock. So, and you replace that with any business process. If you have somebody who's taking a major procurement decision and you get something counterintuitive like that, they will say, wait, whoa, why, I'm not going to do this. You tell a surgeon, amputate that leg. They said, no, why? What are the options you've considered? So the system has to be able to explain very, very clearly why it's recommending something, all the options that are there. And then whoever is working with the system has to be prepared to understand and interpret that type of explanation, right? They have to get to some level of sophistication so they understand, okay, it's actually trying to, it's laying out the odds of, why this is better than the other one, etc. So you have to then, that means also train your workforce that has been working there to essentially do this. So now you've got trust, you've got explainability, you've got training and retraining and skilling your people. And then if it's data about people, then you get into issues where potentially you can discover something that violates the privacy of an individual, because you're discovering new things with AI. So it's not like saying, okay, yeah, this is definitely somebody's personal health information, because I can see it, right? It has their name, it has what they are suffering from, what diseases they have. But let's say if the program actually inferred that somebody likely has diabetes or something like that, you don't know that's going to happen, but it potentially could happen, right? It may be just looking at patterns of behavior, what food they eat, what exercises they do, etc., and eventually come to the conclusion, high likelihood this person is suffering from a disease. Now, once you've discovered that, if there are no safeguards around it, it will violate somebody's privacy. So privacy, those aspects come into play. Bias, if it's a hiring program and it's biased towards certain individuals, that again can blow up in your, as a business, it can just blow everything up, and it won't be possible to sustain it. So there are all these other aspects that, in fact, what we have learned are perhaps even more important than the algorithms themselves to work into the paradigm. That's where the slowness comes in. When you try to bring it to an enterprise, this is where the slowness comes in. So that's the reason why it takes long. Even we've discovered that the hard way. We won we beat the world champion in chess in the 1990s, right? And then in 2011 we had a computer program that won the Jeopardy championship. So from an algorithmic standpoint, we were up there, very, very sophisticated. But it took us this long to figure out that there are all these other factors that go around trust and ensuring certain other aspects about this technology so that it moves in the right direction. And enterprises will not embrace it until you do that. So that's why in the enterprise, it's kind of a game that's just starting. But even so, I've given you some of our experience with the segments with regard to like customer care and employee experience, etc., where there's tremendous value that clients are seeing, and we've seen ourselves.
Right. Yeah, there's some crazy things which is happening in the space of AI, but exactly we don't really know what is it doing and how is it doing. It's still a black box. There are people working on explainable AI, and maybe soon we'll kind of understand what those algorithms are actually doing. You mentioned that there'll be people still making decisions, but with these more and more algorithms which is being created, where there's more and more decisions being being taken by these algorithms. I would like to talk about the automation bit, but I'll get into that later. You be invested in the healthcare space also. So could you kind of give some examples on how AI, big data is being leveraged for transformation in the healthcare industry?
Yeah, no. So, but just to make a comment on what you just said, explainability is a major focus. So, I mean, from an enterprise standpoint, if your algorithms are not explainable, they will not work. They will not be adopted. It will not be a success. So, it is not just a question of this is something we'll get to. It's something that has to be there. And this also goes to that other point, which regard to as these things get more automated, some things will get more automated. There's no doubt in my mind about that. But there will be other things that will not be that automated, mainly because just think of it. If you're, I'm again thinking about this from a business standpoint, right? If you're an established business, you're competing. You're not just going to allow anything to happen. And this is where the judgment that people have that will be exercised. It will be, it will evolve to work with these machines, etc. But those fundamental characteristics of enterprises and businesses are not going to change. There will be certain examples, like for instance, algorithmic trading, where you're making sub-second responses, etc., where yes, it will be black box. But for the most part, I mean, that's just not going to work, which is why it's going to be slow. What was your? I've forgotten your other question. That was
You've been invested in the healthcare industry. How AI and big data is being leveraged for healthcare.
So healthcare has been one of the earliest verticals for AI, right? Even when I was doing my PhD, there was a program. I think it was called Mycene or something. It had to do with diagnosing a single condition and of healthcare, that this would be better. And then you got, of course, by now there's a major expansion with regard to healthcare and diagnosis, and you have companies that are even working on automating drug discovery by using AI, speeding up clinical trials. There's a lot of activity around healthcare. There's also, on the enterprise side, the healthcare companies are also going after digital transformation. Because again, there's the issue is that you've got data that's very siloed, and not just in one organization, but perhaps scattered across many organizations. And so again, there's advantage to be had by moving forward and doing that. So in a sense, it's an industry that is very ripe for applications of sophisticated approaches to big data and AI, but perhaps with even more of the safeguards that I had mentioned to you earlier, because of the nature of that industry, with lives being at stake and with trust being a premium, just as you play that out. So I think those aspects will play even more strongly in the healthcare space.
Could you explain what the IBM AI Blueprint is?
So the IBM AI Blueprint goes back to my comments about what does AI mean for an enterprise, for a business, right? It means you have to apply it to every major business process. So now, if you just step back from that and think, what does that entail? It actually means that you have to make progress along 4 dimensions equally, because if you go too far ahead in one or the other, things will slow down. And this again goes back to your question also, why things are slow with regard to AI. So there's obviously the data piece of this, because the data has to be up to speed, right? It has to be up to function. Otherwise, if you use an AI program on data that has of very lower quality or poor quality, you're not going to get the right conclusions. In fact, you'll get the wrong conclusions, right? It's garbage in, garbage out. It's that type of thing. So data has to be prepared. So there's one effort around data. Technology has to be prepared as well, because when you apply the more sophisticated AI techniques, you're literally running hundreds of thousands of experiments very rapidly for the system to actually learn from large amounts of data. And to be able to pull that off, you have to have specialized processors that work with your normal computers. And so those interconnects have to be very fast. So there's not just software, there's also engineering that needs to come into play and things of that nature. So technology is a huge part of what needs to be done. Then, because it has to be applied to a business process, you need to have knowledge about that domain, right? So the business process aspect comes in. If you're doing changing your supply chain, right? I mean, what are you going to do? You have to essentially understand supply chain means you have to forecast risks. It could be risks about weather. It could be risks about political events. It has to have knowledge of where all your suppliers are and what's impacting them. So you've got to then really understand the process and how you make that. What changes are you proposing there? And then finally, like I made the point earlier, processes are about people. So you have to prepare your people for this, right? The culture has to change. They have to be comfortable working with these systems. They have to be comfortable understanding. It's difficult when somebody has not worked with an AI system as to what that interaction entails. They have to be prepared at multiple levels. The last being culturally to be able to do this. So all four dimensions of data, technology, process, and people, they have to move in lockstep. Otherwise, if you get too far ahead in one or the other, it's all slows down. And many people don't really appreciate, especially the people and process aspect of it. They think, we get the technology, we've got these really souped up algorithms, and everything is going to be fine. And then nothing really moves, right? Nothing happens. People refuse to embrace it. It's not particularly well suited for the process, the way they've implemented it. All kinds of things happen. And then everybody shelves the project because they say there's too much money has been spent. We have to just scrap this. So this is why you've got to. So the blueprint really is a model for how you move all those four things forward at the same time.
NVIDIA has created a digital twin of sorts of the complete Earth to, for climate forecasting and things like that. Do you see AI and big data playing a role in mitigating these unforeseen global impacts?
Oh, yes. No, absolutely. Now, just, digital twin, that's a major push in terms of a trend that is happening now. You're seeing that, right? I mean, essentially, you have some physical device or manifestation of some scenario, and you create a digital version of that based on real world experience as well as simulators that you might be using. So it's a powerful concept applied in many different ways. I think from a climate change, also just natural disasters, impact on vegetation. We've seen firsthand, we've had experience firsthand that making use of big data and AI is going to have a tremendous impact in doing that. So from an ESG standpoint, also for enterprises, I think that's going to be quite a game changer to have these technologies in play. So I think there's tremendous potential to make use of these technologies in those contexts.
Right. So, talking about automation, you were saying that earlier in the course of the conversations that we'll always have people in the loop, who'll be making the decision. But today we're collecting so much data, and data is key for everything for an organization, So do you see in the near futures possibly algorithms replacing CEOs? I know it's a far out thing, but address that question if you might, and also possibly talk about the reskilling and upskilling thing, because there's so much automation. Today we have text to code, everything is being automated, and we thought that the creativity space is something that the AI would not touch, but it's seeping in over there also with the I imagine Dolly 2 and so many other things happening.
This thing about AI and creativity versus not, etc. This goes back again, all the way back to when kind of computers were created, right? I mean, Alan Turing, the famous cryptographer as well as computer genius, one of the very early pioneers in the space. He was actually asked, will these machines think? And the way he explained it was, they won't think in the sense that you and I think, but they will think in a way that machines think. And I think that's the way to look at it, that there is going to be creativity. It's going to be in a different type of dimension than what we do, which is why I say that when it comes down to it, the processes and essentially the relationships and all the different social interactions that we've set up, in a way, it's very unique to us. There are going to be aspects in that obviously there's going to be, it'll expand the dimensions of the creativity by making use of these machines. But it's really important to understand that they think differently from what people do. Now, once you kind of accept that, and then you come back to the business premise in terms of how businesses are set up by people, uh, trust, those aspects are huge when it comes in. So you really end up in a situation where I think that and this is an IBM position, it's got to be human centered. So that's a key distinction. Now, could you have efforts that are non-human centered? Totally, but we think that's it. We just don't think that will even hunt in the market eventually, because it will break down. There will be things that will so it's a differentiation, a business differentiation in our view, for the use of AI in human-centered ways, because we think that is the right direction. Even from a business success standpoint, we really don't think that the other approaches are going to be as successful for the various reasons that I explained. I don't think the adoption is going to be there.
Would you have any advice to entrepreneurs, enterprise here in India?
Yeah, I mean, I will say one thing, right? Just based on all the questions, this is why shows like yours are very needed, because I do believe that it's extremely important for people to be involved in the evolution of these technologies. So I'll go back to, Ben Franklin, who was one of the founders of the US. He ended up creating libraries in every neighborhood in the US. So if you drive around in the United States, no matter where you are, which state, every county essentially, or even neighborhood, will have a public library. It's, everybody, anyone can go in there, get books, etc. And when he was asked why he wanted to do this, he said it's because knowledge cannot be limited to just a few. Knowledge has to be disseminated widely, otherwise, the chance for misuse, etc., can occur. These technologies that we're in today, think of that as the updated version of what he was talking about, which is why I think shows like yours are critical. But I think people have to get extremely involved in the evolution of these technologies, and so that's the main point I would make. I think in terms of entrepreneurs, tremendous opportunities in this space. It's just a great space to be in. I mean, just think of it. I've been working it now for over 2-3 decades, and it's everything that I did then is still relevant today. So it's not that it's in fact it's only expanding in scope and impact. So tremendous opportunities for entrepreneurs in this space. These are critical technologies. So, from the standpoint of a powerhouse, technical powerhouse like India, obviously it makes complete sense to fully push the boundaries on this kind of stuff. And then people, like I said, generally people have to be very involved.
All right. Thank you, sir. Really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. And you say, yes, I think, knowledge needs to be spread out, because, so far it's always been the case, that the people who are dwelling in the urban areas are the ones who could access knowledge. But I guess because of the internet somehow democratized knowledge, you could be sitting in a rural area, but if you have an internet connection and a desire and intent, you can get the world's knowledge, and you can reach out to anyone, create businesses, and there's some crazy things happening in the space of technology. And I think everybody needs to play a role, because here we are post COVID. Things have completely upended. We were talking about digital transformation, but we've been thrusted into it with this convergence of AI, IoT, blockchain, Web3, metaverse, and it's a never-ending of what's happening and the changes which is being brought by the technology, and how it can completely upend a life. So I guess anybody who wants to create a better future should start learning or understanding what technology and express through this language, because I believe that the language of English is giving way to the global language of technology. If you can learn that language and express it, to create your idea into a product solution, I think that the world is going to be super awesome and fantastic. Really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. Is there a blog or website that you would recommend to our listeners, and how can people connect with you post the podcast?
So people should just link in with me if they want to follow me or just interact with me. LinkedIn is a really good way to do that. And then we have several blogs that are actually available online off the IBM websites, and we'll be happy to give you those links as well.
Thank you, sir. Really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Bye. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.